This girl reveals her millionaire father's secret and shocks everyone. You won't believe what she said. Comment and give my story a rating from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The summer rain beat against the windows of the mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, as Arthur Castle found himself surrounded by piles of belongings that his mother had kept for decades. At 52, he never imagined that organizing the objects of a lifetime could be so painful. Each yellowed photograph, each old document, brought back memories that he preferred to keep buried in the past. Meredith, his wife of 45, watched him from the doorway, noticing how he held each item with unusual tenderness. "You don't have to do this alone," she murmured. But Arthur only nodded, lost in thoughts about the father who had abandoned the family 3 decades ago. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, interrupting the heavy silence. Meredith went down the marble stairs, wondering who could be visiting on such a rainy afternoon. When she opened the door, she encountered a sight that left her speechless. A little girl, no more than 4 years old, soaked by the rain with dirty and torn clothes, holding something against her chest as if it were a treasure. "Pretty lady," said the child with a thin but surprisingly firm voice, "I need to talk to Mr. Horace's son." Meredith blinked several times, trying to process what she had just heard. Horace was the name of her father-in-law, whom she had never met, the man who had abandoned the family when Arthur was young. "How do you know that name, child?" The girl raised her small hand, revealing a faded photograph. "Your father never left," she declared with a conviction that sent a shiver down Meredith's spine. "He's alive and lives in a blue house in the Brooklyn Heights neighborhood." Arthur appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the voices. When he saw the scene, he descended quickly, his eyes fixed on the wet child who was shivering with cold in the entrance of his house. "Who are you?" he asked, crouching down to be at the girl's height. "My name is Daisy," she replied, handing him the photograph with trembling hands. "And this is proof that your father didn't go to heaven." Arthur took the photograph and felt his legs weaken. It was an image of his parents when they were young, a photo that he was sure he had seen before, but that had disappeared years ago. On the back, shaky handwriting had scribbled an address, Azalea Street 247, Brooklyn Heights. "Where did you get this?" Arthur asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "Grandpa Horace gave it to me," said Daisy, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her dirty t-shirt. "He takes care of us in the blue house, but I ran away because the other kids ate my food." Meredith looked at her husband, seeing the conflict of emotions unfolding on his face. During their 15 years of marriage, she had witnessed how the absence of his father had shaped Arthur, creating wounds that never completely healed. Seeing this child there, wet and vulnerable, bringing impossible news, was like watching 2 worlds collide. "Arthur," Meredith whispered, "perhaps we should take her inside first. She's soaked." Daisy took a step back, her large, dark eyes shining with distrust. "I won't go in if you don't believe me. Grandpa Horace said that his son would want to see him again." The rain intensified, creating a curtain of water that isolated the mansion from the rest of the world. Arthur looked at the child, then at his wife, and finally at the photograph in his hands. The resemblance between his young parents and his memories was undeniable, but how could a street child have access to something so personal? "Come in," he said finally, stepping aside. "Let's talk properly." Daisy hesitated for a moment before stepping onto the polished marble of the entrance hall. Her bare feet left mud marks on the spotless floor, but neither of the adults seemed to care. Meredith hurried to fetch towels, while Arthur continued studying the photograph, looking for signs of forgery. "Daisy," he said, crouching down again, "tell me more about this Grandpa Horace. What's he like?" The girl's eyes lit up for the first time since she had arrived. "He's really old, has white hair, and always smells like medicine. He tells stories before we go to sleep, and he makes sweet porridge on Sundays. But he gets sad when he looks at this photo." Every detail that Daisy shared seemed to fit with the fragmented memories that Arthur had of his father. The smell of arthritis medicine, the habit of telling stories, the melancholy expression he always carried. But how was it possible? He had been at the funeral, had seen the coffin being buried. Meredith returned with warm towels and clean clothes that were left over from when her teenage niece had visited. "Daisy, honey, how about we take a warm bath and put on some dry clothes? We can talk better afterward." The girl looked at Arthur as if asking for permission. He nodded, still lost in his thoughts. While Meredith took Daisy to the bathroom, Arthur stood alone in the hall, holding the photograph and trying to process the impossible. His phone rang, and he answered it distractedly. It was Robert, his partner in the construction company. "Arthur, I need a decision on that project in Brooklyn Heights. The contracts are ready for signature." "Brooklyn Heights?" Arthur repeated, a strange connection forming in his mind. "Robert, do you have the exact address of the construction site?" "Sure, it's on Azalea Street, right next to number 247. Why?" Arthur hung up the phone with trembling hands. The coincidences were piling up disturbingly. First, a child appearing with an impossible photograph. Now, he discovered that his own company was building practically next door to the address she had mentioned. When Daisy came out of the bathroom, clean and wearing clothes that were too big for her thin body, Arthur made a decision that would change everything. "Daisy, can you take me to this blue house?" The girl nodded vigorously. "Now?" "Now," confirmed Arthur, ignoring Meredith's worried look. "I need to see this with my own eyes." The drive to the Brooklyn Heights neighborhood was tense and silent. Daisy was sitting in the back seat of the luxury car, watching through the window as the streets became progressively simpler as they moved away from downtown. Meredith held her husband's hand, feeling the tension radiating from him like waves of heat. When they arrived at Azalea Street, Daisy pointed to a modest two-story house painted in a faded blue. "It's there," she said, her voice suddenly small. "Grandpa Horace must be making dinner for the kids." Arthur stopped the car in front of the house and watched it for several minutes. It was a simple construction, with a small garden in the front where some children were playing. Nothing in that scene suggested that something extraordinary was about to happen, but his heart was beating as if he were running a marathon. "Arthur," Meredith murmured, "maybe we should think better before—" But he had already gotten out of the car, walking toward the door like a man in a trance. Daisy ran after him, her small steps echoing on the wet concrete. When he knocked on the door, the world seemed to have stopped spinning. Steps approached from the other side, slow and careful. The door opened, revealing an elderly man with white hair, wearing an apron soiled with flour. For a moment that seemed like an eternity, the two men stared at each other in silence. "Arthur?" the older man whispered, his voice breaking on the single word. And that was how Arthur Castle discovered that everything he had believed about his family had been a carefully constructed lie. The tears that rolled down Horace Castle's face seemed to carry the weight of 3 decades of regret. At 78, the man Arthur believed to be dead stood with difficulty, leaning on the doorframe as if he needed something solid to keep from collapsing. "My son," Horace murmured, extending a trembling hand toward Arthur's face. "You've grown so much. Become a man." Arthur remained motionless for several seconds, his mind struggling to process the reality before his eyes. The man in front of him was visibly older, with deep wrinkles marking decades of worry, but his grey eyes were unmistakably the same ones he remembered from childhood. "How?" was all he could whisper, his voice failing completely. Daisy hid behind Arthur, watching the scene with wide eyes. Meredith approached slowly, her expression alternating between fascination and disbelief. In the back of the house, children's voices could be heard, mixed with the clatter of pots and the smell of simple food being prepared. "Come in, please," Horace said, stepping back. "There's so much to explain, so much you need to know." The interior of the blue house was modest but welcoming. Old but well-cared-for furniture occupied a small room, where photographs of children covered practically every available surface. Arthur recognized some of the faces. Street children he occasionally saw begging in downtown. "How many children live here?" asked Meredith, her voice filled with an emotion she couldn't identify. "8 at the moment," replied Horace, wiping his hands on his apron. "Sometimes more, sometimes less. They come and go as life allows. Daisy here is one of the newest." The girl clung more tightly to Arthur's leg as other children began to appear in the room, curious about the well-dressed visitors. They were thin but clean faces, eyes that carried difficult stories but that shone with a spark of hope that only the presence of genuine care could keep lit. "Dad," said Arthur finally, the word coming out like a painful sigh. "Mum cried for years. She died believing you had abandoned us. How could you—" "Because I loved you too much to let anything happen to you," Horace interrupted, his voice breaking. "There were dangerous men after me, Arthur. Debts I couldn't pay, people willing to hurt my family to get to me. The only way to protect you was to disappear." Meredith sat down on an old chair, trying to absorb the magnitude of what she was hearing. "But the wake, the funeral, we saw— A friend of mine who owns a funeral home helped me stage everything," admitted Horace, lowering his eyes with shame. "Empty coffin, fake death certificate. He knew about the problems I was facing and agreed to help. It cost me all the savings I had." Arthur sat down heavily on the sofa, his legs finally giving way under the weight of the revelation. Daisy climbed beside him, snuggling against him with surprising familiarity. "And these children? How did you end up taking care of them?" "I started with just one," explained Horace, a sad smile touching his lips. "A girl I found picking through trash behind the market. I couldn't just pass her by. I brought her home, took care of her, and soon others appeared. Word spreads fast on the street when someone offers a plate of food and a safe place to sleep." One of the children, a boy of perhaps 6 years, approached Horace and tugged on his pants. "Grandpa, isn't Iris coming back today?" Horace's face contracted with visible pain. "No, my son. Iris isn't coming back so soon." Arthur noticed the tension that settled in the atmosphere with the mention of that name. "Who is Iris?" Is Daisy's mother," said Horace hesitantly. "A young woman who worked here with me for a few months, helping to take care of the children. She disappeared 2 weeks ago, leaving only a letter saying she would return when it was safe." Daisy stiffened against Arthur, and he could feel small tremors running through her small body. "Mommy went away because the bad man was going to hurt her," whispered the girl, her voice almost inaudible. "What man?" asked Meredith, crouching in front of Daisy. But the girl only shook her head, burying her face in Arthur's chest. Horace approached and placed a gentle hand on the child's hair. Daisy witnessed some things that a child shouldn't see. Iris was being chased by a man, someone from my past who found out where I was. The connection hit Arthur like lightning. "The creditors, are they still after you?" "One of them, at least," confirmed Horace. "Cornelius Vargas. He never forgot about the debts. And when he found out I was alive— Well, Iris paid the price for being close to me." Meredith felt anger growing in her chest. For years, she had watched her husband carry the pain of his father's abandonment, seen how it had shaped his cautious personality and his difficulty in fully trusting people. Now she discovered that it had all been a well-intentioned lie, but one that had cost decades of unnecessary suffering. "Where are her belongings?" asked Arthur, a strange suspicion forming in his mind. Horace hesitated before answering. "I kept everything in a box in my room. I thought, when she came back— Can I see?" Horace's room was Spartan, with only a simple bed, an old wardrobe, and a table where papers and bills were piled up. Under the bed, he pulled out a shoebox tied with string. Inside, Arthur found women's clothes folded carefully, some cheap jewelry, and at the bottom, a series of documents. "Iris Mendoza," Arthur read aloud, examining an identity card. 24 years old, born in Staten Island. But it was another document that caught his attention, a rental receipt with an address that he recognized immediately. It was from a residential building that his own construction company had built 2 years before, located in the south zone of Greenwich. "Dad," said Arthur, showing the paper, "this address, I know this place." "That's where she lived before coming to work with me," explained Horace. "She said she needed a safer place for her and Daisy." Meredith examined the other items in the box, her attention being drawn to a small notebook with a worn cover. Upon opening it, she found notes in a feminine handwriting, shopping lists, work schedules, and at the end, some pages that made her blood run cold. "Arthur," she called out, her voice tense, "you need to see this." The last pages of the notebook contained desperate notes. Cornelius showed up again, moved to Grandpa Horace's house, Daisy having nightmares, and finally, he knows where we are. "I need get out of here before someone gets hurt." "She didn't abandon Daisy," Meredith murmured, understanding the magnitude of the situation. "She was forced to flee to protect all of you." Horace sank onto the bed, the weight of guilt crushing his fragile shoulders. "It's all my fault. If I'd been more careful, if I hadn't let Cornelius find out where I was." "Dad," said Arthur, sitting beside him, "you saved these children. You gave them a chance they wouldn't have anywhere else. That counts for something." But even as he tried to comfort his father, Arthur knew that the situation was far from resolved. A mother had been separated from her daughter by circumstances that he himself could have helped to avoid if he had known that his father was alive. A traumatized child was clinging to him in a way that awakened protective instincts he didn't even know he possessed. And somewhere in the city, a dangerous man still posed a threat to everyone he loved. Daisy had fallen asleep leaning against him, her small, irregular breathing suggesting troubled dreams. When Arthur tried to move, she squeezed his arm tighter, mumbling "Mommy" in her sleep. "She does that every night," observed Horace sadly. "Calls for her mother until she falls asleep from exhaustion." At that moment, Arthur made a decision that would change all his priorities. He looked at Meredith and saw in her eyes the same determination that he felt growing in his chest. "We're going to find Iris," he declared, his voice filled with a conviction that surprised even himself. "And we're going to end this once and for all." Outside, the rain had stopped, but heavy clouds still covered the sky, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what fate had in store for that makeshift family that had just reunited after decades of lies and pain. The next morning brought a painful clarity to Arthur. He had spent the night awake, pacing through the mansion while processing the revelations of the previous day. Meredith found him in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, drinking cold coffee and studying Iris's documents that he had brought from Horace's house. "You haven't slept at all," she observed, sitting beside him at the granite table. "How could I?" Arthur replied, running his hands over his face. 30 years, Meredith. 30 years believing that my father had abandoned us, carrying that pain, building my entire personality on a lie." Meredith took his hand, feeling the tension in every muscle. He did what he thought was right at the time. Desperate men make desperate decisions. And now, a child is paying the price for his cowardice. Arthur continued, his voice filled with bitterness. "Daisy lost her mother because of the debts that my father incurred decades ago." The phone rang, interrupting the conversation. It was Robert, his partner, calling earlier than usual. "Arthur, we have a problem. The project in Brooklyn Heights is delayed because we discovered irregularities in the adjacent land. It seems someone is making threats to the residents of the area." Arthur straightened up in his chair. "What kind of threats?" "Collection of old debts, extortion. A Cornelius Vargas is terrorizing local families. The city is considering suspending our license until the situation is resolved." The name hit Arthur like a punch in the stomach. Cornelius was actively causing problems in the same area where his father lived, where his company was building, where Iris had lived. The connections were too disturbing to be coincidental. Robert, I need you to investigate this Cornelius discreetly. Find out where he operates, who his associates are, how we can neutralize him legally. Arthur, this isn't our problem. We should focus on business, and it's our problem now. Arthur interrupted with a firmness that surprised Robert. Do what I'm asking. After hanging up, Arthur went to the room where Daisy had slept. Meredith had installed her in the old guest room, providing suitable clothes and some toys they kept for when their niece visited. He found the girl awake, sitting on the bed, drawing on a paper with a pencil that Meredith had given her. "Good morning, Daisy," he said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Can I see your drawing?" The girl hesitated before handing over the paper. It was a simple but disturbing drawing, a small woman running from a much larger, dark figure, while an even smaller child cried in the corner of the sheet. "Is that your mother?" Arthur asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Daisy nodded. "Mommy ran very fast. The bad man yelled ugly things." "Daisy, do you remember the name of this man?" "Cornelius," she whispered, and began to tremble. "He has a scar here," she said, running her finger across her own cheek, "and he smells like stinky cigarette." Arthur felt anger rising in his chest, a primal emotion that he had not experienced in a long time. This man had traumatized a 4-year-old, separated a family, and all because of debts that his own father had incurred. "Daisy, I promise we're going to find your mother," he said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "But I need you to help me. Can you remember anything else about where Cornelius lives or where you saw him?" The girl closed her eyes tightly, as if trying to ward off bad memories. "He has a store near the red gas station. Mommy went there to get money sometimes." Arthur knew of only one gas station with those characteristics in the area. It was a few blocks from the building that his company had built, where Iris used to live. The pieces of the puzzle were fitting together disturbingly. Meredith appeared at the door with a breakfast tray. "How are our morning artists?" "Daisy is helping me understand some things," Arthur replied. "Meredith, I need to go out today. I have to check some addresses, ask some questions." "I'm going with you," she said immediately. "No, it could be dangerous, and someone needs to stay with Daisy." Meredith looked at the girl, who was watching the conversation with large, attentive eyes. In recent months, while they had been trying to get pregnant without success, she had found herself imagining what it would be like to have a child at home. Now, with Daisy there, she felt a maternal instinct awakening that was both wonderful and frightening. "Can I stay here with Grandma Meredith?" Daisy asked, using the same affectionate term she had given Meredith the day before. "Of course you can, honey," Meredith replied, feeling her heart warm with the title. "We can bake cookies and maybe paint some watercolors." Arthur left home 2 hours later, driving towards downtown Greenwich with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. First, he stopped at the construction company's office, where Robert was waiting for him with a folder full of information about Cornelius Vargas. "It wasn't hard to find out about him," said Robert, sliding the folder across the table. "The man doesn't bother to be discreet. He operates a loan shark business in a convenience store, charges exorbitant interest rates, and has a history of intimidation that goes back decades." Arthur opened the folder and found photographs, addresses, and a list of known victims. Among the names, he recognized some residents of the neighborhood where his father lived, people who were probably being terrorized by the same man who had caused so much suffering to his family. "Robert, I want you to hire a private investigator. Someone discreet but efficient. I need everything about this man, where he lives, his habits, his weaknesses." "Arthur, this is getting too personal. Maybe we should involve the authorities." "The authorities don't care about people like my father or those children," Arthur replied dryly. "They see poor people fighting each other and prefer not to get involved. But I can get involved. I have resources, influence, contacts. It's time to use all of that for something that really matters." His next stop was the building where Iris had lived. The doorman, a middle-aged man named Walter, remembered her well. "Polite girl, always greeted everyone," he said, scratching his prominent belly. "But she lived in fear of something. She always looked back when she entered the building, as if she was being followed. Did she say anything about problems with any man?" "Not directly, but once I heard her on the phone crying, saying she couldn't afford certain things anymore. She talked about a child who was in danger." Arthur felt his stomach churn. "When was the last time you saw her?" "About 3 weeks ago. She left in the early morning with a small suitcase carrying the girl in her arms. The child was crying and she seemed terrified. She never came back." After leaving the building, Arthur drove to the gas station that Daisy had mentioned. It was an old establishment, with an attached convenience store that sold everything from sodas to cleaning products. A faded sign advertised, "Quick loans, consult us." Arthur parked across the street and watched. The traffic was constant, humble people entering with hope and leaving with expressions of despair. Some looked scared, others resigned. All carried the weight of someone who had made a deal with the devil. His phone rang. It was a message from Meredith. "Daisy asked if you're coming back for dinner. She's worried that the bad man got you too." The message broke Arthur's heart. A 4-year-old was worried about his safety while he was there planning a confrontation that could put everyone at risk. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't back down. Daisy deserved to have her mother back. His father deserved to live without fear, and he himself needed to prove that he was capable of protecting those he loved. At that moment, a man came out of the convenience store, tall, burly, with a visible scar on his right cheek. Even from a distance, Arthur could feel the aura of intimidation that he radiated. Cornelius Vargas finally had a face. The man lit a cigarette and stood in front of the store, like a predator marking territory. Arthur watched as some people crossed the street to avoid passing near him, as others lowered their eyes when they were forced to greet him. When Cornelius finally went back into the store, Arthur made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going home as Meredith and Daisy expected, he called the private investigator that Robert had recommended. "I need detailed information about a man," he said when the call was answered, "and I need it tonight, no matter the cost." Meanwhile, at the mansion, Meredith was discovering that taking care of Daisy awakened feelings she didn't know she possessed. The girl was intelligent and affectionate, but also deeply traumatized. She asked constant questions about when her mother would return, had nightmares during her afternoon naps, and startled at any loud noise. "Grandma Meredith," said Daisy while they decorated cookies, "why do people do bad things to other people?" It was a question for which Meredith had no adequate answer. How to explain to a 4-year-old that the world was sometimes cruel, that some people hurt others for greed or power, that adults couldn't always protect those they loved? "Sometimes people are in a lot of pain inside," she replied carefully. "And when they don't know how to deal with that pain, they end up passing it on to other people." Was the bad man in pain? "Probably, honey. But that doesn't make right what he did to you and your mother." Daisy nodded solemnly, as if she were processing information too complex for her age. "Grandma Meredith, if your Arthur finds my mother, will she take me away?" The question hit Meredith like a stab. In less than 2 days, that child had become an essential part of her life, filling a void that she didn't even know existed. The idea of losing her was unbearable. But at the same time, she knew that Daisy deserved to be with her real mother. "The important thing is that you're safe," she said finally, "and that you're happy." But as she spoke, Meredith wondered if she would be able to give up Daisy when the time came, or if she would try to find a way to keep that makeshift family together, even if it meant challenging social and legal conventions that she had never questioned before. The private investigator Paul Sykes called Arthur at 10 o'clock at night with information that completely changed his perspective on the whole situation. Arthur was in his home office, surrounded by papers and photographs, when the phone rang. "Mr. Castle, I've discovered something that you need to know immediately," said Paul, his voice tense. "Cornelius Vargas is not acting alone. He has a silent partner, someone who provides capital for his loan shark operations in exchange for a percentage of the profits." "Who?" asked Arthur, feeling a chill in his stomach. "Dr. Howard Brandt, one of the city councillors. The same man who approves construction permits for your company." Arthur almost dropped the phone. Howard Brandt had been a business ally for years, facilitating approvals and streamlining bureaucratic processes. The idea that he was funding the criminal activities that terrorized poor families was too shocking to process. "There's more," Paul continued. "Iris Mendoza didn't disappear to hide. She went to Dr. Brandt asking for help, thinking he could intercede with Cornelius. It was a trap. Brandt is keeping her on a rural property he owns in upstate New York, forcing her to work as a domestic without pay." "Slavery," Arthur murmured, the word coming out like poison. "Exactly. And there are documents proving that he uses this scheme with several desperate women. Iris isn't the first, nor will she be the last if we don't act." Arthur hung up the phone with trembling hands. All the facilitated approvals, all the favors that Howard had done for his company over the years, it had all been funded by the suffering of people like his father, like Iris, like Daisy. He had been, unknowingly, an indirect beneficiary of an exploitation scheme that shattered entire families. The next morning, Arthur gathered Robert, Paul, and a trusted lawyer in his office. He also called Meredith, who brought Daisy to the meeting. The girl needed to be present to formally identify her mother when they found her. "The plan is simple," Paul explained, spreading photographs and maps on the table. "Dr. Brandt's property is 40 minutes from here. It's isolated, with only one access road. Iris is there along with at least 3 other women in a similar situation." "How do we know she's still alive?" Meredith asked, holding Daisy in her lap. "I got recent photographs," Paul replied, showing images taken with a telephoto lens. "She's working in the garden on the property. She appears to be physically well, but clearly in a state of captivity." Daisy stirred when she saw the photos. "It's my mommy," she exclaimed, trying to grab the images. "She's sad." "Why is she sad?" Arthur crouched in front of the girl. "Daisy, your mother is in a place where she doesn't want to be. But we're going to get her out of there today, okay? You promise?" "I promise." The plan they developed was risky but necessary. Robert would contact the appropriate authorities, not the local police, who might have connections with Brandt, but the FBI, which had jurisdiction over cases of forced labor. Arthur and Paul would go to the property to confirm Iris's exact location and document the evidence. Meredith would stay with Daisy at a nearby hotel, ready for the reunion. The trip to upstate New York was tense. Daisy slept most of the way, but when she woke up, she asked questions that broke Arthur's heart. "Will my mother recognize me? What if she doesn't want to live with me anymore? Will the bad man try to get us again?" With each question, Arthur felt the weight of responsibility grow. It wasn't just about reuniting mother and daughter, it was about breaking a cycle of exploitation that had lasted decades, about facing a corrupt system that he himself had unconsciously fueled. Brandt's property was exactly as Paul had described, an isolated farm surrounded by high walls, with security cameras and locked gates. From a high point on the road, they managed to observe the movement through binoculars. "There," whispered Paul, pointing to a female figure working in the garden. "That's her." Arthur focused the binoculars and felt his heart clench. Iris was visibly thinner. Her movements were slow and tired, but she was alive. Beside her, other women worked in silence, all with the same expression of resignation and fear. "How long until the FBI arrives?" Arthur asked. "Robert said they're on their way. They should be here in an hour." But it was at that moment that everything went wrong. A car approached on the road. It was Cornelius, accompanied by 2 men who clearly weren't farm workers. Arthur and Paul hid behind a tree, watching as the group entered the property. Through the binoculars, they saw Cornelius gesturing aggressively towards the women. One of them, not Iris, but another young woman fell to the ground, apparently after being hit. It was then that Arthur made a decision that would change everything. "We can't wait," he said, putting away the binoculars. "They're going to hurt these women." "Arthur, we're just 2 men against at least 4. It's suicide." But Arthur was already running down the hill towards the walls of the property. He couldn't stand still while Iris and the other women suffered a few feet from him. Daisy was waiting for her mother, and he had made a promise. What followed was a sequence of events that tested all the limits of courage that Arthur thought he possessed. He managed to climb the back wall while Paul created a distraction at the front of the property. He arrived in the garden at the exact moment when Cornelius raised his hand to hit Iris. "Stop!" Arthur shouted, emerging from the bushes. The confrontation that followed was brief but intense. Cornelius recognized him immediately. After all, Arthur was a well-known figure in Greenwich's business circles. But what he didn't expect was the fury he saw in the businessman's eyes. "Old Horace's son," said Cornelius with a cruel smile. "Come to pick up Daddy's little girlfriend." "I came to pick up the mother of a 4-year-old child that you traumatized," Arthur replied, positioning himself between Cornelius and the women. It was Iris who broke the impasse. Recognizing Arthur from the photographs that Horace kept, she shouted, "You're Horace's son. Is Daisy okay? Is she safe?" "She's with me," Arthur replied, "and you're going back to her today." The sound of approaching sirens ended the confrontation before it could escalate to physical violence. The FBI arrived in full force, arresting Cornelius, his henchmen, and finding enough evidence to dismantle the entire forced labor operation. Dr. Howard Brandt was found trying to destroy documents in his office at City Hall. The files they managed to save revealed years of corruption, bribery, and complicity with criminal activities that went far beyond loan sharking. The reunion between Iris and Daisy happened 2 hours later at the hospital where the rescued women were taken for medical examinations. When Daisy saw her mother walking down the hall, she ran with a speed that surprised everyone present. "Mommy! Mommy!" she shouted, jumping into Iris's arms. The hug between mother and daughter lasted several minutes, both crying and laughing at the same time. Arthur and Meredith watched from a distance, their own eyes filled with tears. "I thought I'd never see you again," Iris whispered, covering her daughter's face with kisses. "I thought they were going to hurt you too." "Grandpa Horace took care of me," Daisy explained. "And then Uncle Arthur and Grandma Meredith gave me cookies and let me sleep in a big bed." Iris looked at Arthur with gratitude that transcended words. "How can I thank you?" "You don't have to," he replied. "Just allow us to continue being a part of Daisy's life. If you want, of course." What followed were weeks of adaptation and healing. Iris recovered physically quickly, but the psychological trauma would take longer. Arthur used his resources to provide therapy for both her and Daisy, and offered Iris a job at the construction company that would allow her to support her daughter with dignity. Horace, finally free from the fear that had haunted him for 3 decades, moved to a larger house that Arthur bought specifically to house the informal orphanage. Now legalized and adequately funded, the home offered not only shelter, but education and real opportunities for the needy children. The biggest surprise came 3 months later when Iris asked to speak with Arthur and Meredith privately. Daisy was playing in the garden with the other children from the orphanage when Iris joined the couple on the porch. "You saved our lives," she said, her words carefully chosen. "But more than that, you gave us something that I alone could never provide. A real family." Arthur and Meredith exchanged glances, not knowing where the conversation would lead. "Daisy talks about you constantly," Iris continued. "Grandpa Horace, Uncle Arthur, Grandma Meredith. You've become an essential part of her world, and I realized that I need a family too." That was how, 6 months after a child appeared wet on the doorstep of a mansion holding an impossible photograph, 2 broken families came together to form something bigger and stronger than any of them could be alone. Arthur officially adopted both Iris and Daisy, creating a legal structure that guaranteed security and stability for both. Meredith finally realized her dream of being a mother, not through the pregnancy she had sought so much, but through the unconditional love she developed for a traumatized child who desperately needed care. Horace lived his last years surrounded by 3 generations of family, seeing his grandson build the kind of loving home he had always dreamed of providing. When he passed away 2 years later, he was surrounded by dozens of children he had saved from the streets, and by a son who finally understood that love sometimes requires sacrifices that seem cruel on the surface, but that protect what is most precious. Daisy grew up in a family where she never doubted that she was loved and protected. Iris found not only safety, but purpose, working at the construction company and using her experience to help other women in vulnerable situations. And Arthur discovered that true wealth was not in the businesses he had built, but in the family he had chosen to love and protect. The small, yellowed photograph that Daisy had brought that rainy afternoon was now framed in the living room of the mansion, next to dozens of other photographs that documented the happy moments of a family, that proved that sometimes the most important words are not "I love you," but "I choose you," repeated every day through small and large actions that build a lifetime of shared happiness. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.